Okay, so across the world you had a power vacuum. Really powerful nations which had dominated huge parts of the world, so Germany in most of continental Europe and Japan in most of Southeast Asia and Central Asia had collapsed, and these areas were experiencing a lack of direction. However, after the war, two clear superpowers had emerged, and that is the USA and the USSR. They had been allies in World War II, as you'd remember, but they had different ideologies and different views for how the world should be structured. As you remember from Year 11, the USSR was communist. Um, they had a very different system of government to the USA, which was democracy. And both of these superpowers were competing with each other. They thought that their ideologies were the correct ones. They wanted allies, they wanted power, and they wanted to spread their ideologies across the world. Their efforts to do this really did divide the world, as you can see in this image here, and it led to a steady escalation of conflict between both superpower blocs. So a conflict between the USA and the USSR. And as most of you would know, this resulted in the Cold War. So the Cold War is called so because it was never a hot war in a typical sense, that it didn't have a direct military engagement land war between the USA and the USSR. Instead, it was permanent hostility between those two countries, between those two power blocs, and there was no actual war between the two. One of the main reasons that there wasn't an actual war between these two superpowers is because both had nuclear weapons. So if one side was to attack the other using nuclear weapons, you could be pretty sure that they would obliterate each other. It would cause nuclear Armageddon. Mutually assured destruction is the term used. So even though they couldn't directly engage and fight each other, they did have a number of conflicts by proxy involving client states, meaning that allies of the US would embroil themselves in war with allies of the USSR. So you can see this in Korea. North Korea was allied with the USSR, South Korea with the USA. That country had a civil war. North and South fought against each other, but they were backed by these really two powerful superpowers. The Cold War lasted for many decades and it varied in intensity. It was most intense between 48 and 53, which is when you see the Berlin crisis that you looked at last term, and steady nuclear escalation. Also during this period here, which we'll look at in the case of Vietnam, and from 79 to 85. You know the end result. It did end with the USSR collapsing and losing, but this was the new world order after World War II, the Cold War. Just so you can see some of the divisions which took place in the world on a map, the terms First World, Second World, and Third World actually come out of the Cold War. So the First World, highlighted in blue here, is the USA and their allies. Sometimes they're called NATO countries because they're all part of the North Atlantic Trade Organization. But basically it's just the USA, Canada, a lot of Western Europe, Australia, and several other countries like Japan. The so-called Second World was the USSR and their allies, which you can see is most of Northern Asia, Eastern Europe, and the USSR itself. The Third World countries were ones who were non-aligned, so they weren't client states or allies of the First or Second World. Sometimes we use this term as a bit of an insult today to refer to poor or developing regions, but the actual origin of the term Third World comes from the Cold War. And a lot of these regions here, particularly in South America and South Asia, experienced a lot of conflict after 1945 because different elements from the First and Second World attempted to influence these countries away from other ones. So for example, the USA attempted to influence many countries in South America to prevent them from adopting communism. And the USSR attempted to influence several countries in Southeast Asia and influenced them towards adopting communism and not democracy. So this is the New World Order after 1945 during the Cold War. Now, one of the social impacts that I want to talk about as a result of the Cold War is something that a lot of you are already really familiar with, and that is the fear of communism, which spread in first world countries during the Cold War. It's sometimes called the Red Scare. Basically, communism was seen as really the root of evil and a really big threat to people in Western nations during the Cold War. So you can see here in some of these PSAs and political cartoons that many things were associated with communism, and that association with communism was negative. So the first one here, organised labour, things like strikes, sit-ins, are seen as basically steps towards communism and chaos. There was also a really great fear of espionage during this period. A lot of US politicians, for example, McCarthy is one of them, saw communist spies literally everywhere. And there was a real culture of fearing communist spies in your neighborhood, potentially collecting sensitive information. This was called the Red Menace. It was to a certain extent real. The US sent a lot of spies to the USSR and vice versa, but it was basically a hysteria for some points of the Cold War. And the reason it was seen, the reason that communism was seen as something to be so fearful of and such a problem is because communism was seen as this force that was just spreading across the world. You can see here from this cartoon with Stalin on an octopus that it's getting its grip on every single continent, that its tentacles are spreading across different nations of the world, and it looks like ultimately they will have global domination of the world. To a certain extent, this fear is pretty understandable because after World War II, as you remember from the map that you saw before, a lot of countries in Eastern Europe fell to the influence of the USSR and became communist states. China, the most populous country on the earth, also became a communist state as well. So you could see how it was seen to be very rapidly spreading and how that spread would look really threatening. The final thing as well, one of the reasons that communism was also so feared is because this spread and the conflict which resulted from the Cold War was really strongly associated with atomic war. So many people in first world countries feared an eventual nuclear war between the USA and the USSR. And it was seen that Stalin, his ultimate hope was to completely destroy America and eradicate the democracy which America held as its political system. Alright, so there's your context, the Cold War from 1945, the fear of communism which spread at that time. Now we're going to be looking at our depth study. So our depth study is nationalism in Southeast Asia. Got a map here for you, Southeast Asia obviously, and we're looking at two key countries, Vietnam and Cambodia. I just want you to take note of the surrounding countries. So Cambodia is locked between Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, and Vietnam is directly south of China, and Japan is a bit further up here. Just going into a bit of the ancient and distant histories of these places, to give you a little bit of context, we'll start off with Cambodia. So Cambodia, quite a small nation with two very powerful nations on each side, Thailand to one side and Vietnam to the other. The countries that are immediately to each side of Cambodia, Vietnam and Thailand, have historically had larger populations, larger militaries. The people of Cambodia are called Khmer, also pronounced Khmer. I'm not really fussy on which pronunciation you use, but apparently Khmer is the correct one. If we go back a bit over 1,000 years, Cambodia had been really heavily influenced by India, mainly from AD 500 on. They adopted a lot of Indian customs, particularly Buddhism, as their religion. They were inspired by the absolute monarchy, the political system of India, and also adopted that. And finally, they were really inspired by their architecture of some of the Indian palaces, temples, that kind of thing. And these influences spread all throughout Cambodia from AD 500 on. After the turn of the century, so after 1000 AD, Cambodia was actually a really mighty power in its region in Southeast Asia. And the Khmer Empire, which lasted from 802 to 1431, was the most powerful empire in its region. It amassed a lot of wealth, it built up some great traditions, and it also established one of the wonders of the world, which is Angkor Wat, which is a temple city. However, over time, this empire did decline and gradually collapse. The decline was due to its more powerful neighbours, particularly Thailand, which kept invading Cambodia and taking key parts of land. But the Khmer Empire period, during the time where Angkor Wat was built, is seen as a really high point of Cambodian history. And Angkor Wat is actually one of the key symbols of the nation.